Valentia Photography Workshops video, the exposure triangle, part 2, the ISO. See part 1 to learn about how apertures and shutter speeds work together, and please subscribe to stay in touch for more tutorials. The third element in the triangle is the ISO, and I've put this at the bottom of the triangle to show that it affects both the aperture and the shutter speed at the same time. Basically what the ISO does is increase the sensitivity of the sensor. It basically fools the sensor into thinking that there is more light than there actually is. And let's say that the correct exposure at 100 ISO was f4 at a 30th of a second. They're just numbers in this case, don't really mean very much, but a fairly wide aperture and a fairly slow shutter speed. Again, we're moving the ISO up in one stop increments, so we're doubling the ISO in the first case to 200. And you'll see then that both the aperture and the shutter speed have increased by one stop. So if we set the ISO to 200, instead of f4 at a 30th, we've now got 5.6 at a 60th, f5.6 at a 60th of a second, to give the same exposure. It's not brighter or darker than it was at 100, it's the same. But what's happening is you've got a slightly smaller aperture and a slightly faster shutter speed. At 400 ISO, we've now got an aperture of f8 and a shutter speed at 125th of a second. So a middling aperture and a reasonably fast shutter speed. At 800, again, smaller aperture, one stop smaller, and 250th of a second, f11, 250th, and at 1600, f16 and 500th of a second. Now, you're not going to get those apertures and shutter speeds with those ISOs necessarily. This depends on the available light you've got in the situation at the time. But what it does show is that, for example, if you needed a smaller aperture, you can increase it until you get the aperture that you want. And similarly with the shutter speed, if this is too slow to handhold at a 30th, or there are people moving or objects moving, you might want to increase the ISO until the shutter speed is faster. What's really important to bear in mind, though, that increasing the ISO will increase noise, which is like a distortion of the colors and in the image, and like speckles on the picture, and it's not pleasant. So it's often a good idea to keep the ISO as low as you can, assuming you can get the aperture and shutter speed that you want to work with. My view on the ISO is that it's the last resort. Change that last. It's, it might take a couple of views of this video to get to grips with what can seem like a fairly intimidating theory, if you like, but once you get your head around it, it can really make a difference to your photography. I hope that was helpful. Please click the subscribe button to stay in touch for more videos from Valentia Photography Workshops and me, Stephen Power. Or there is half the amount of light coming in, and so the shutter speed needs to be twice as fast to let that light stay on the sensor for double the amount of time in order to balance the exposure. And similarly, going wider with the aperture, letting in Double the amount of light here from one stop to another means that the shutter speed now needs to be faster because it only needs to stay on the sensor half of the time. This can be a fairly complex topic if you're not used to it, so I would suggest going over the video more than once, and it will eventually be very useful to you. In part 2, I'm going to look at how the ISO affects the shutter speed and the aperture at the same time. So please click the subscribe button if you'd like to stay in touch and to get more videos from Valentia Photography Workshops.